It was the kind of case that made you question everything, the nature of truth, fate, and even the very things you believed were impossible. My name is Detective Liam Grant, and up until that point, I'd lived in a world ruled by logic and evidence. Premonitions and psychic visions had no place in it. Or so I thought. The call came on a cold Thursday evening. The kind of night when the wind howled against your windows, carrying whispers of the unknown. The victim was one Delilah Greer, a celebrated psychic whose reputation preceded her. She'd made headlines predicting stock market crashes, high-profile divorces, and even a plane crash that had narrowly been averted thanks to her cryptic warning. People called her a fraud, but just as many swore by her abilities. Delilah was found dead at the estate of Eleanor Lockhart, an old-money heiress with a taste for the eccentric. Eleanor had hosted a private séance that evening, inviting only a handful of close acquaintances. By the time I arrived at the sprawling mansion, the place was buzzing with tension. Guests stood in clusters, whispering in hushed voices, their expensive clothes doing little to mask their unease. The body was in the drawing room. Delilah Greer lay slumped over the antique table, her lifeless hand resting on a crystal ball that gleamed under the chandelier's dim light. Her face was frozen in an expression of terror, as though she'd seen something that shook her to her core in her final moments. The scene was chilling, but it was the note clutched in her other hand that caught my attention. "They'll try to stop me," it read in jagged, hurried handwriting. "But I've seen it. I know how this ends." The forensics team worked quietly around me, dusting for prints and photographing the scene. I couldn't take my eyes off the note. It felt too deliberate, too staged. A premonition or a carefully planted red herring? That was the question. "Detective Grant?" A voice snapped me out of my thoughts. It was Eleanor Lockhart herself, her tall frame and sharp cheekbones giving her an air of authority. She was dressed in a flowing silk gown, her fingers heavy with rings that glittered even in the dim light. "Ms. Lockhart," I greeted her. "I'll need to ask you a few questions about tonight." She gestured toward the study, and we moved away from the growing crowd of police officers and onlookers. The study was a grand room with walls lined with bookshelves and an imposing mahogany desk. Eleanor poured herself a glass of brandy and offered me one, which I declined. "You hosted the séance tonight?" I began, pulling out my notebook. "Yes," she said, her voice steady but her eyes betraying a flicker of unease. "It was supposed to be an intimate gathering. Just myself, Delilah, and 4 other guests." "And what happened?" "Delilah seemed off, even before we began," Eleanor said. She kept muttering about something she'd seen. Something dark. During the séance, she suddenly screamed and collapsed. We thought it was part of the act at first, but then she didn't move. "Who were the other guests?" "Victor Lane, my financial advisor, Margaret Hensley, a family friend, Dr. Nolan Price, a psychiatrist, and Celeste Marlowe, Delilah's assistant." She paused, taking a sip of her brandy. "All of them were in the room when it happened." I jotted down the names, each one a potential suspect. "Did Delilah have any enemies? Anyone who might want to harm her?" Eleanor hesitated. Her predictions didn't always sit well with people. She knew things about them, things they didn't want to be revealed. But as far as I know, she didn't have enemies. Not here, at least. "What about the note in her hand? Any idea what it means?" Eleanor's eyes flickered to the side. "No. I'd never seen it before tonight." Her answer didn't sit right with me. Something about her demeanor felt guarded, like she was holding back. But pressing her too hard now wouldn't get me anywhere. As I stepped out of the study, I caught sight of Celeste Marlowe, Delilah's assistant, standing alone near a window. She was a young woman with sharp eyes and an air of quiet intensity. She'd been crying, but when she saw me approach, she straightened up and fixed me with a determined gaze. "Detective Grant, I need to talk to you," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "There's something you need to know about Delilah." Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Whatever she was about to tell me, I had the feeling it would change everything. I gestured for her to follow me into a quieter corner of the room, away from prying eyes and ears. Celeste hesitated for a moment, glancing nervously over her shoulder, before stepping closer. Her hands trembled as she clutched a tissue, twisting it between her fingers. "What is it you need to tell me?" I asked, keeping my tone calm but firm. She took a shaky breath. "Delilah, she knew this would happen." I frowned. "You mean she predicted her own death?" "Yes," Celeste said, nodding quickly. "But not just in some vague, mystical way. She was specific. She told me 3 days ago that she saw herself dying in this house, during this séance. She begged me to cancel it. Why didn't you?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. I tried, Celeste said, her eyes filling with tears. But Eleanor wouldn't hear of it. She said Delilah was being dramatic, that the show must go on. Delilah was terrified, detective. She was convinced someone was going to kill her. Did she say who? Celeste hesitated, her gaze darting toward the study where Eleanor had disappeared. No, not directly. But she did say that someone at this séance had a secret they were willing to kill for. That hit like a punch to the gut. Secrets. A psychic who made a living revealing them. And now a murder. I couldn't help but wonder how many secrets had been floating around this room tonight, hidden beneath designer clothes and polished smiles. Did Delilah leave any other warnings? I pressed. Anything else she said or wrote down? Celeste hesitated, biting her lip. She kept a journal. She wrote down everything she saw, every vision she had. It's in her bag in the room where Her voice broke, and she looked away. I'll have the forensics team take a look, I said, trying to keep my tone gentle. But I need you to be honest with me, Celeste. Was Delilah scared of Eleanor? She shook her head quickly. No. At least, not that she ever said. But Eleanor was. She paused, as though searching for the right word. She was controlling. She wanted to own Delilah's gift, to use it for her own gain. Delilah hated that. That was an interesting angle. What about the other guests? Did Delilah mention any of them? Celeste hesitated again, her fingers twisting the tissue so tightly it began to tear. She didn't trust Victor. She said he had shadows around him. Something he was hiding. But that's all she said. Victor Lane, the financial advisor. I filed that away for later. Thank you, Celeste, I said, handing her my card. If you think of anything else, call me. As she walked away, I turned back toward the drawing room. The forensics team had bagged the note from Delilah's hand and were carefully searching through her belongings. I spotted her handbag sitting on a side table and signaled for one of the officers. Check for a journal, I said. It might be important. Moments later, they handed me a small leather-bound book. I flipped it open, scanning the pages. Delilah's handwriting was neat but hurried, the words flowing together as though she couldn't write fast enough to keep up with her thoughts. They're closing in, one entry read. The shadows are getting darker. I see betrayal. I see greed. And I see blood. My blood. I turned the page, and my heart skipped a beat. The next entry was a list of names: Eleanor, Victor, Margaret, Nolan, Celeste. Beside each name, Delilah had scrawled a single word. Eleanor, power. Victor, lies. Margaret, guilt. Nolan, secrets. Celeste, fear. Beneath the list, in bold, jagged letters, was one final warning. One of them will kill me. I closed the journal, my mind racing. Delilah Greer may have been a psychic or a fraud, depending on who you asked, but one thing was clear. She'd known her life was in danger. The question was whether her visions had revealed the truth, or whether her killer had used them to their advantage. The suspects were all in the house, and the clock was ticking. It was time to find out which of them had a secret worth killing for. As the investigation unfolded, the layers of secrets and lies surrounding Delilah's murder began to unravel, one strand at a time. I started with Victor Lane, the financial advisor. His smug demeanor cracked when I confronted him with Delilah's notes. He denied everything, but a search of his office revealed documents showing he'd been embezzling from Eleanor's estate for years. Delilah had confronted him after a private reading weeks prior, warning him that his secret would soon come to light. So what? He snapped when I pressed him. I'm not a killer. I wanted her gone, but I didn't touch her. He had motive, but his alibi, a security camera from his firm showing him arriving late to the séance, checked out. Next, I turned to Margaret Hensley. Her connection to Delilah was deeper than she let on. The family friend facade masked years of guilt over an affair she'd had with Eleanor's late husband. Delilah had unearthed the affair during a reading, threatening to destroy Margaret's fragile relationship with Eleanor. I begged her not to say anything, Margaret admitted tearfully, but she swore she hadn't killed Delilah. She claimed she'd spent most of the séance too drunk to move. The autopsy and timeline corroborated her story. Dr. Nolan Price, the psychiatrist, was harder to crack. He dismissed Delilah's abilities as nonsense and denied any connection to her beyond professional curiosity. But his secrets turned out to be deeply personal. Delilah had discovered he was prescribing unapproved medications to wealthy clients, earning him a fortune on the side. He'd been furious when she threatened to expose him. She was a fraud, he sneered when I confronted him. And now you're going to take her word over mine? Still, nothing solid connected him to the murder. Celeste, Delilah's assistant, was the last person I questioned. Her fear had been obvious from the start, but I hadn't understood its source until now. It wasn't fear of Delilah's killer, it was fear of Delilah herself. Celeste revealed that Delilah had been blackmailing her for years, threatening to expose a teenage mistake that could have ruined her career. She wasn't the woman everyone thought she was, Celeste whispered. She used people. She hurt people. Her confession was raw, but I believed her. Celeste had hated Delilah, but she wasn't a killer. That left one name, Eleanor Lockhart. Eleanor had been calm, almost too calm, throughout the investigation. I confronted her in her study late that evening, journal in hand. She didn't flinch when I read aloud the word Delilah had written next to her name, power. You wanted to own Delilah, I said. She was your prize, your connection to something no one else could touch. But she wanted out, didn't she? She threatened to leave, to take her talents somewhere else. Eleanor swirled the brandy in her glass, her expression unreadable. You're very good, detective, she said softly. But you're wrong. Am I? I asked, stepping closer. Delilah predicted her own death. She warned me that someone here had a secret worth killing for. And then I realized, what if her prediction wasn't a premonition? What if it was a setup? Eleanor raised an eyebrow, but I saw a flicker of something in her eyes. You knew about the journal, I continued. You knew she'd written down her fears. You used it. You poisoned her drink during the séance, knowing the scene would play out exactly as she'd described. Her premonition wasn't a warning, it was the perfect alibi. Everyone would assume she saw it coming, that it was inevitable. Eleanor's calm facade began to crack. Do you have any proof of this wild theory, detective? She asked, her voice icy. I do, I said, pulling out a small vial from my coat pocket. The forensics team found traces of aconitine in Delilah's wine glass. A rare poison. Guess where they found more of it? In the greenhouse behind your estate. The same greenhouse that only you have access to. For a moment, Eleanor said nothing. Then she laughed, a cold, bitter sound. Delilah was a parasite, she said finally. She fed off people's pain, their fears. She thought she could leave me? After everything I gave her? No, detective. I couldn't allow that. She stood, her tall frame casting a shadow across the room. Do you really think anyone will care? She was a fraud. I'll walk away from this. You won't, I said firmly, signaling to the officers waiting just outside. As they entered to place her under arrest, Eleanor's confidence faltered. For the first time, she looked afraid. Later that night, I sat alone in my office, Delilah's journal open on the desk. She'd written so much about shadows, secrets, and blood, but in the end, it wasn't fate that killed her. It was human nature, greed, power, and betrayal. I closed the journal and leaned back in my chair, staring out the window as the wind howled against the glass. It was the kind of case that made you question everything, the nature of truth, fate, and even the impossible. But at the end of the day, the answer had been simple. The dead don't lie. Only the living do.